Hey everybody, I hope your evening is going well tonight. This evening we are looking at Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the 10 virgins, which is found in verses 1 through 13. There are two major parables we could say that come from Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents. Next week we'll talk about the parable of the talents. So, as we always do with the background, the text, and the application, we again begin by looking at the background, what we need to know in order to, that's given in the text in order to help us begin to understand the parable. With the text, we just again sort of summarize what goes on, and then the application, we again take the points that are made that Jesus is getting across and point out how we can make the application that we need to, just as Jesus is trying to get these points across to his disciples at that time. So when we look at Matthew 25, the chapter begins when Jesus is in the middle of a thought, which is very important to understand because we need to go back and understand where that speech or thought, where does it begin? And so if we go to the beginning of Matthew chapter 24, that's where the discussion begins. And it begins in what we see verse 1, again, sort of tying in with the end of Matthew chapter 23, talking about the temple. Jesus has come out, departed from the temple. His disciples are with him. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 24 that his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And of course, we know that the temple is very important was important to Judaism, right? Because it was seen as the house of God, the dwelling place of God. And even though this is not the Temple of Solomon, that was certainly a very lavish temple, the second temple was still relatively nice. Maybe not as nice as what Solomon had, but nice nonetheless. And so when we look at Matthew 24, what Jesus does after that, there's great admiration for the temple. And essentially what he does in the first part of the chapter is he just sort of reminds the disciples that, even though this temple looks nice, it's not going to be here very much longer. And again, he talks about the destruction of the temple, which in a way encompasses sort of the first half of that chapter. And then Jesus goes on and talks about really the second coming of Christ. And you might think to yourself, why is Jesus talking about the second coming of Christ when, 2,000 years later, he hasn't returned again? Well, keep in mind that Jesus points out in Matthew 24, verse 36, no man knoweth, not the angels, but only the Father, but my Father only. So Jesus knows that the second coming will occur, but even he himself, at least according to this text, doesn't know personally himself. And so thus it's still important to remind them that this day is coming. And so when we look at Matthew chapter 24, sort of as a whole, what Jesus is getting across here is that what you would see later on, even after the church is established, a lot of Christians would be tempted by reverting back to Judaism. And in large part, the book of Hebrews has to deal with that, showing the superiority of Christ over Moses, the superiority of the New Testament over the Old Testament, in part to help stem the tide of Christians that are reverting back to Judaism. And for some of these Christians, especially once you get closer to the destruction of the temple, there was again a push for at least the Jews there in Palestine to break free of the Roman Empire and to rid themselves of Roman authority in the area. And so in a lot of ways, what Jesus is warning his disciples about, if you think about it in the context of the destruction of the temple, is that for some of these Christians, it would have been very easy to get caught up in all the activity about driving the Romans out of Judea. Maybe one way in which we can look at this passage. And so I think that ties in well, maybe even with what, with this being an election season and all that, with currently with what's going on in our country, the tendency to get caught up in the physical things that at the end of the day don't matter. Because for the Jews at that time, it didn't matter if they drove the Romans out of Palestine. What mattered, of course, was being a part of the church and doing the work of the church and preparing yourself for the coming of Christ, whenever that may be. And for them, of course, because Christ didn't return within their lifetime, it was, making sure that by your death you were prepared and you were in a good state in that position. And so likewise, this parable really is a good parable for us to think about in light of what we're going through, because, some people get caught up in maybe election season. And really, even though those things might be important to an extent, it's not the end of the world, right? If your person doesn't get elected, right? At the end of the day, there are more important things to worry about. And for us, of course, that is where our standing is in light of being in the church and being a faithful member. Whether the end of our life comes on our deathbed or whether it ends with the second coming of Christ, the point is to be prepared. And so now, having explained all of that, that makes sense in Matthew chapter 25, because the end of Matthew chapter 24 is Jesus just points out the question, who is a faithful servant? Matthew 24 verse 45, who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord hath made ruler over his household? Notice this, to give them meat in due season. Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. The point is, be prepared, because there's a moment in which you're going to essentially give an account for what you've done. And sometimes that moment is not always occurs when we think it will be. And so now the idea of being prepared for that moment is where we enter into Matthew chapter 25 with the parable of the 10 virgins. And again, we're not going to read through the parable in its entirety, but we do want to point out that the parable, again, talking about the kingdom of heaven, and we're given the example of five foolish and 5 wise virgins. 5 of them, of course, as the text said, they were wise because they had plenty of oil. 5 are not wise because they did not have enough oil. And so what we're being given here is a description of the celebration around a wedding, which this is a little bit different from our customs in our day, because one of the things that we point out is that generally the day of the wedding, that there is a feast that is held in the bride's home. And the thing about that feast is that it could last for a long period of time. It could even last up to multiple days. And so one of the things that came after that feasting is that the groom would take the bride back to his house or to his parents' house. And often, at least sometimes was the case, is that there would be a sort of like a wedding party that would follow the groom and the bride back to their house, and there would be people that were waiting on them to welcome them to either the groom's home or the parents of the groom's home. And that's what we sort of have pictured here. We've got 10 virgins that are probably at the household of the groom or the groom's parents that are waiting for the groom and the bride, along with a wedding party, to come back to the groom's home. And so in light of them not necessarily knowing how long this feast would last, there is, again, a need to be prepared, because you want to properly honor the marriage. And so in order to do that, you take the time to be prepared and to be there when they arrive, no matter how long it might take. So we note again, Matthew 25, that 5 of them are wise. There's a cry made, verse 6, essentially a call saying that the bridegroom, he's on his way. Again, the time is at hand. Again, don't necessarily know exactly how long between the call and the arrival. So there are some, the 5 wise, that have enough oil at this point, right? And they go out and they do what would normally be done with welcoming the bride and groom back to the groom's house. They go out and they prepare to meet them. There are 5, though, that recognize that they do not have enough oil. And so they make the plea to the other 5 wise, just the simple plea of, give us your oil. And so that way they could also be present when the bride and groom arrived. But the wise, verse 9, answered and said, if we give you some of our oil, very well may be the case that we don't have enough oil either. And so we're both out of luck in that position. And so their response is to the 5 foolish, you go to the market and buy some. And so they do so. But the problem is, verse 11, those 5 foolish virgins that have gone away, verses 10 and 11, those 5 foolish virgins that have gone away to buy oil for their lamps in the marketplace, the groom and the bride have arrived, and they have entered into the home, the door shut, and so the celebration in the groom's home begins. And so the 5 foolish return, verses 11 and 12, wanting to enter in, but the groom is very clear and says, verily I say unto you, I know you not. And Jesus concludes that parable with the very simple verse, "Watch therefore, for ye know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh." And so the point being is that, again, the point being to the disciples here is that, make sure that you are prepared when the Son of Man returns again, whenever that may be. Right? Make sure you've prepared your life. You've done whatever's necessary to where you can enter in and be a part of that celebration. And so, again, the application to us is pretty particular when we look at this passage, right? One thing that we can note is that partial preparation is not good enough in order to be a faithful servant, right? And when we look at the parable, it's not as though that the 5 foolish virgins didn't prepare at all, right? They did bring their lamps. They did bring some oil. Their lamps obviously burned for a time period. And so you can't say that they didn't completely prepare, because they did. They had their lamps and they had at least some oil. But the problem is that they only partially prepared. And partial preparation is not good enough. And we can make points out like that. We could talk about the plan of salvation, right? There's some people that, in a sense, partially prepare, right? They may hear the gospel, they may believe it, they may repent, they may confess Jesus, but if they're not baptized for the remission of their sins, they might have partially prepared, but they didn't fully prepare. And so, likewise, whether that's their death or whether it's the second coming of Christ, they're locked out of the celebration in heaven because they didn't fully obey the gospel like they knew they should have, and what's given in the Bible. And so, partial preparation in that sense isn't good enough. There's some people that are fully converted. They are right on their way. We might could say they're right on their way to heaven in the way that they're living. But then there comes a certain time period in life where they get caught up in the things of the world, and they begin to get caught up in more physical concerns and lose light of what their condition is in Christ. And even though they prepared at points in their life, if they don't continue that preparation, well, then they only partially prepared. And so, again, partial preparation, if you're not continually faithful, partial preparation is not going to help you out in terms of being faithful to Christ. And so we always have to ask ourselves again, what is it that stops us from being prepared? For some of these Jewish Christians at the time, maybe it was trying to hold on to the law of Moses, or trying to hold on to that fervor of a lot of other Jews that were trying to drive the Romans out later on when you talk about the destruction of the temple. For us as Christians, maybe we focus on the wrong things, whether that's politics, whether that's sports, whether that's entertainment or work or things of that nature, so much so that we put more time into that, and we don't put enough time in preparing our souls for being faithful to Christ for His second coming, or being prepared on His deathbed. And so, partial preparation that's not good enough. We have to think about the things that keep us from being prepared. And then finally, we do want to note that the timing of the preparation is key, in the sense that there comes a time when you won't have adequate time to prepare. And I know one of the things that we've been talking about in church history, for instance, is that some of the early Roman rulers that converted to Christianity, sometimes, I know it was the case with Constantine, he waited until his deathbed until he was baptized. And the point being is that there will come a time when preparation's not good enough, and some people have the mindset that they sort of put off obeying the gospel, or they put off repenting, and sort of like in the book of Acts, they wait until a more convenient season, as the ruler did in that particular case. Well, the point is that you don't know when the moment of preparation, or at least you don't know when the last moment is to finally prepare. And so we always have to operate under the mindset that we should, as long as we are on this earth, we should be continually preparing and showing ourselves faithful to God. So that way, when the day of judgment comes, whether that's after our death or whether that's with the second coming of Christ, that we're ready and we're prepared for that. And so we have to make wise use of the time that we have now. And so hopefully these are some thoughts that we think about when we look at Matthew chapter 25. Again, you want to keep in mind what goes on in Matthew 24 in light of how that affects Matthew 25. And so we'll continue to talk about that more because we'll talk about the parable of the talents next week. But I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I hope to be able to see you all on Sunday. So have a good weekend.